I have started recording. So just a quick announcement. So the assignment 1 due date that was originally on OnQ it's too early. So it's been moved, I think, to the 18th. Is that right? Yeah, it's been moved till after the weekend. Assignment 2, the original due date is changed to 1 day before the due date. Now, the reason I had to change assignment 2 to 1 day before the due date is because of this 7-day universal accommodation. It would be nice if you could see the assignment solution before your quiz. So the only way I can do that is if I move assignment 2's due date 1 day ahead. That way you can see the solution 1 week after, which gives you a full day to look at the assignment solution if you want it before the quiz. I guess any questions about the course so far? All right, so we were talking about integer overflow in the previous lecture. So I've said everything I want to say about integers in Java right now. For the most part, when you're using them, they behave the same as Python's ints, except that there's no exponentiation operator, right? You have to call a Java method to compute a power. And you also have to watch out for integer overflow, because that doesn't happen in Python either. Right? Now, I guess I should explain why it doesn't happen in Python. It's true that it doesn't happen in Python, but the price you pay for not running into integer overflow in Python is that Python is very slow compared to languages like Java or C, where integer overflow is a phenomenon that can happen. Right? So in Python, Python's actually written in, the default implementation of Python is actually written in C. So the reason it doesn't happen in Python is because there's a whole bunch of code that takes care of the cases where, or that every time you do an integer operation in Python, there's a bunch of code that checks whether or not the result overflows. If the result overflows, Python has to compute the result all in software, instead of relying on the computer's hardware to perform the calculation for you. In Java and in C, whenever you do an integer operation, ultimately that gets converted into a CPU operation, which happens very quickly. Right? So Python is a lot slower in terms of its integer speed calculations than in languages like Java or C. All right, so what happens if you don't want integer values? So you want to compute things using values that look like real numbers. Right? So if that's the case, then you want what's called a floating point type. And the usual choice in Java is the type called double, right? Which is a bit unfortunate because in Python, you might know that the type is called float. Right? The corresponding float type in Java is not the same as the float type in Python. So in Python, the corresponding type, in Java, double is the type that corresponds to Python's float. Right? For the most part, these behave exactly the same because both Python and most implementations of Python and all implementations of Java say that the representation of double fits a standardized representation, which we'll talk about later in the course. So they behave more or less the same. In both languages, the size of a double, so the amount of space that a double occupies in memory, is fixed. Right? And again, that leads to the same implications that you have with int. There's some minimum value that you can represent, and there's some maximum value that you can represent. Right? So the greatest double value that you can represent is encoded in this, or stored in this constant called double, big D double, dot max value. That turns out to be a very large value. It's roughly 10 to the power 308. So it's enormous. The most negative value is just the negative of the maximum value. Right? Now, turns out there's also a value, a smallest positive value that you can represent. Right? So the value closest to 0 is called double min value. Right? So you have to be careful about that too. Right? With the integer types, min value and max value, min value is the most negative value, max value is the most positive value. For double, min value is the smallest positive value, right? It's not the most negative value. I don't remember what that is. It's 10 to the minus something. It's very small. Okay, so to write down a double number, you just write down a number with a decimal point in it. Right? So any number that appears that has a decimal point does not end with F or F, either upper or lowercase f, is a double literal. Right? If there's an F on the end, then it's a float literal. Right? So you don't want to put the F on the end if you're using double. So anything with a decimal point is Java considers that to be a double value. Right? Like the ints, you can put in underscores if you want to separate the digits to make it a little easier to read. If you know what this thing here is, this is called scientific notation. I don't know if they tell you about this in 121. So you can write down any number here. Doesn't have to have a decimal point in it. Then the letter E, and then some integer value here. Right? And so the way you read this is as 1.00000099. The E means times 10, and then the 6 is the power, or the exponent. Right? So that's roughly 1 times 10 to the power 6. Right? That number there has to be an integer. It can be negative, so you could have 1-ish times 10 to the minus 6 if you wanted to. Right? So that's called scientific notation, which is anything written in scientific notation is also considered to be a double, unless I forget where the F has to go. I don't know if it's there or if it's, I think it has to be here. Right. Okay, if you do an operation with two doubles, you always get back a double. Right, so here I've got the doubles 1, 3, and 13. Right? If I compute x plus y, that gets computed as a double. Right? X is a double, y is a double, so x plus y is also a double. Right? You've got subtraction, multiplication, division, and parentheses as well. Right? So all of the basic arithmetic operators, there's no exponentiation operator. Right? If you need exponentiation, you have to use math.pow. Okay, so what about overflow? So the floating point type, so double does not overflow, right? So you will not occasionally, you will often see people on the internet writing stuff about floating point numbers and how they overflow or how they might overflow. They don't overflow. They saturate. Right? So what that means is if you try to compute a number that doesn't fit in the range of double, then what you end up with is the value positive infinity or negative infinity, depending on whether the value is negative or positive. Right? So the largest double value is roughly 10 to the 308, right? So that would be 1, E308. Right? So this is 10 to the 200 times 10 to the 200. That's 10 to the 400, which is beyond the range that double can represent. Right? If you calculate that result, x ends up being the value positive infinity. Right? That's minus 10 to the 400. So that becomes double negative infinity. Right? So they don't wrap around like they do in with the integer values. Okay, and that's all I need to say about computing stuff with double values, right? Because everything else behaves the same as Python. All right. So what about subroutines or procedures or what Python calls functions? Right? So you all know you can write a Python function, right? Here's a function called max2. It computes the maximum value of A and B. It does so in a very strange way, and I'll explain why why we're doing it this way shortly. Right? So to compute the maximum value of A and B, I'm going to compute A plus B plus the absolute value of A minus B. And I claim that the maximum value of those two numbers, you just divide that sum by 2, and you get the maximum value. Right, now obviously you can use an if statement, but I'd have to tell you what an if statement looks like in Java before we can do it that way. So I'm just going to use arithmetic to calculate the result. Right? If you want to call your function max2, right, and if you're inside of a different module in Python, you would import the module that max2 is defined in, and then call the function like that. Right? So you would pass in a value for A, you'd pass in a value that's for B, right? And hopefully this thing prints out, gives you back the value 5. Right? So there's your function, right? Def, function name, argument list, parameter list, colon, indent the function body. Right? Now the reason this works, you might wonder why this actually works, right? So it's A plus B plus the absolute value of A minus B divided by 2. Right? The reason this works is as follows. Right? So imagine that this is the a number line, either the integer or double, it doesn't matter, or real number line, it doesn't matter. Right? You have a value here, you've got a value here, you want the maximum value. So I want to know that this is the maximum of the two values. Right? I don't know what order the user or the caller is passing in A and B. Right? So A might be the minimum, it might be the maximum. Right? So in this case, A is the minimum. In this case, A is the maximum. Right? So on the bottom, we've got A and B flipped around. It doesn't matter which case you're in. The midpoint is just the average of the two values. Right? So it's A plus B divided by 2. Okay, so what's the distance between the 2 points? Right? So the distance between the 2 points is just this point minus this point and take its absolute value. Right? Now it doesn't matter if the points are A, if this is A or if this is A. Right? You just need to take the difference and compute the absolute value. So that distance is just the absolute value of A minus B. Right? Now, if you start at the midpoint and go half this distance, you end up here. Right? So starting at the midpoint, which is A plus B divided by 2, add half of that distance, so add 1/2 of A minus B absolute value divided by 2, and you always end up at the maximum value. Right? Do a little bit of arithmetic here, and you can get A plus B plus the absolute value of A minus B, all divided by 2, which is what that is. Right? And so that's why that works. All right, so how does this work in Java? So Java has no functions. Right? So that is, I can't just write a standalone function in Java. Right? So the closest thing that we have in Java to a function is something called a public static method. Right? So what's a method? So a method is just a function that lives inside of a class or something else. We'll talk about the something else later. Right? So the closest that I can get to that, those 3 lines in Python, is this in Java. Right? I have to make a class. Inside that class, I can create my method. Right? And when I create the method, it's got a bunch of stuff in front of it. Right? This part here looks almost the same as in Python. Right? That's pretty close. But the rest of it is all different. So let's pull this apart one piece at a time. Oh, in a second we'll do this. We'll pull this apart in a second. Now, once I have this method, suppose I want to call this method from somewhere else, right? From another class that's technically inside of another package, but I'll get to that in a second, right? I have to import the class that the method is defined in, right? So I have to import this class. So there's my import statement. Create another class. Inside that class, I can have a main method, and in that main method, I can call the method, the max2 method. Right? When I call max2, I need to use the name of the class that it's defined in. Right? So again, notice that there's a lot more stuff you have to write in Java compared to Python. Okay, so let's take a look at the actual function/method. Right? So in Python, indentation is fundamental to the language. Right? That's how Python denotes the body of a function, or of an if statement, or a for loop, or whatever. Right? So you need this indentation here. Right? Hopefully you didn't get caught into the trap where however you wrote this indentation, whether you use the tab key or the space, it has to be identical. Right? So it's either 4 spaces, some fixed number of spaces, or it's a tab. But it can't be both. Right? It can't be one or the other. All right, so in Java, indentation is not required. Right? So it's only used for readability. Right? Python, fundamental. Java, language doesn't care. Right? So the compiler that reads your code doesn't care. People reading your code care. Right? So all Java programmers are going to expect your code to be indented in a consistent way. Right? So I can take my Java class and I can write it like this. Right? And I think you'll all agree this is very hard to read. Right? So I've got the class here, then I've got the brace, and then I've got the public static int here, and then I've got the max2 on the next line, and so on and so on and so forth. Right? The indentation here is a mess. The compiler, again, doesn't care. It will happily accept this. and if you write a main method, it'll happily run. Right? Don't do this. Right? When you write your method, it should look like this. Right? So here's your class. Anything that's inside the class gets indented one level. Right? Anything inside the method gets indented one level. Right? And so you want to format your code so that it's easy to read and it's consistent. Right? The indentation should be consistent. Right? Don't use different levels of indentation. Right? So in other words, don't put this return statement a few spaces over or things like that. Okay, so if Java doesn't care about spacing, how does it know that this thing max2 is inside this class? Right? And similarly, how does it know those two lines of code are inside the method max2? Right? And the answer is Java uses braces. Right? So the opening brace and the closing brace shown in red, right? That delimits the body of the main method. Right? The opening brace and the closing brace in that pale blue color, that denotes the body of the main max2 method. Right? The braces are required. Right? That brace must be there. That closing brace must be there. That brace must be there. And that brace must be there. Right? So Java is what's called a brace-delimited language, right? Which is the same as C. Right? So Java uses braces instead of spacing. Oops. All right, so that's the end of that's the end of that deck of slides, but there is another set of slides. So this is the third lecture, right? Okay, so this is from Python to Java. It's the slide set number 3 in the lecture in the on queue. Okay. When you declare your class, right? You need to say class and then the name of the class. For the time being, all of our classes are public. Someone asked what exactly this means in a previous lecture. For now, all that you need to know is that this thing public is what's called an access modifier. Right? It simply states that lecture 2, the class lecture 2, is visible to all other classes. That's what public means. Right? You don't have access modifiers in Python, so these are new. Okay, so for the time being, all of our methods are also public, right? So this is the max2 method, and so the keyword public should be the first word that you write when you're creating methods, at least for the time being, right? Later on in the course, we'll explain exactly what your access modifiers are and how they affect the visibility of this method, right? So for now, a public access modifier simply means that this method is visible to any class that can see lecture 2, right? All other classes can see lecture 2, so in this case, max2 is visible to all other classes. Okay, also for the time being, all of our methods are static, but that's going to change in a couple of weeks. Right? So the keyword static in Java means the method belongs to the class called lecture 2, right? So in other words, it's associated with the class lecture 2. Later on, you'll see that methods can be associated with individual objects instead of being associated with a class, right? But for now, everything's static. If I want to use max2 somewhere else, I have to write lecture2.max2, right? So I have to tell the compiler that, hey, this max2 method, it actually lives in the class lecture2, so that the compiler knows where to go and find the method. Okay, so max2 is the name of the method, right? Now, in Python, you would just write a comma b, right? But remember that in Java, variables have a type, right? And so the parameter list here is actually saying that there's 2 variables that belong to the method max2. Right? There's one called A, there's one called B. All variables in Java have a type, so I have to give them a type. Right? So my max2 method is going to work with ints, right? So an int A and an int B. Right? You might ask what happens if I want to compute the max of 2 doubles. The answer is you have to make a separate method that takes in 2 doubles. Is that your question?
So what if it's one is n here and one is double?
So when you call the method, you have to make sure that the arguments that you pass to the method match the type of the parameters, right? So if that's int and that double, When I call the method, I pass in an int for A, and I pass in a double for B. Right? Does that answer your question? You still...
We create like two classes?
Two classes. You can create two different methods with the same name, but different parameter lists. Right? So if you want a method that computes the max of two doubles, right, it would be public static, that'll become double, max 2, double A, double B.
My question was like, when you say method, what if first, like A is integer and B is float?
And B is a what, sorry?
Float.
A double, right. So you would write another method, right, where this is int, that's double. And in this case, you have to, so I haven't explained what that is yet, right? So in that case, you have to decide what is your return type, right? So if you're passing in an int and a double, what is the result? What is the type of the result, right? It's probably going to be a double in this case, yeah. But yeah, you would have to write a different method in order to compute that result. Right? Notice again the difference between Python and Java, right? In Python, you can have any type you want for A and B. As long as plus and absolute value are defined, it'll work just fine. That's not the case in Java. You have to, the types become important now.
So it's not just integer and that will be 1 here, 1.
You can.
Static int.
Yeah. You can, but then that method is going to expect an int and then a double value, right? The caller or whoever's using the method can't pass in a double and a double, for example, right? You would need a different version of the method that can accept the parameters of those types. The order matters, yes. The order is important. Yeah. Question?
You mentioned that you can create two different methods with the same name
Yeah.
and have them different and have different parameters.
Yeah.
Does Java just like infer which one you're referring to you want to use?
Yes. These are all excellent questions. Yes, it tries to pick the method that most closely matches your the arguments that the user is using to call the method with. Yeah. But the rules there are very complicated. And I never explain exactly what they all are because they're very complicated. It's actually, in this course, you never run into the problem, but you can run into the problem where you've got a bunch of methods with the same name, different parameter lists, and it's not clear which method is being called because of the rules that are used to determine which one. Yeah. Yeah, at the back? Default, no, there are no default parameters in Java. Yeah. Any other questions? All right. Okay, a Java method is allowed to return a value, is allowed to return no value, or it can return exactly one value. Again, another big difference compared to Python, right? In Python, you can write a function, it can return no value, right? Or it can return an arbitrary number of values, right, using a tuple. Right? In Java, it's either no value or exactly one value that's returned. Right? The fact that you can only return one value from a Java method is sometimes inconvenient. Right? Sorry? Okay, so if a method returns a value, then it has to say what is the type of the returned value. Right? So that type name appears before the method name. So that's the int in this case. Right? And so this method here says that max2 takes in an int a and an int b and returns a value whose type is int, right? The larger of a and b. If a method returns no value, then you should use the keyword void to indicate that it returns no value. Right? So main is a method that returns no value. So it returns. So that's why it's always public static void main. Right? So void means method returns nothing. Any other type indicates that the method returns a value of that type. If your method returns a value, there has to be a return statement in the method, right? So this is similar to Python, where a Python function can return a value. Right? So here, max2 returns an int. So somewhere in this method, there must be a statement that says return, and then the value that's returned. Right? Whatever this value is here, its type must be compatible with that type there. Right? So in other words, twice max divided by 2 has to be an int. Right? And you know from what I told you in the previous lecture that it is. Right? So twice max is an int. Right? The 2 is an int. So twice max divided by 2, according to Java, is always an int. Right? Even if twice max is odd. Right? Your method stops running immediately after a return statement. Right? So right after return twice max divided by 2 semicolon, that's where your method exits. If you have a void method, there's no return statement. Right? So you don't return anything from a void method. If you really want to, you can write down just return nothing. Right? So that's legal, but no one writes that. Right? Okay, so what does an if statement? Oh wait, let's do something else. So let's look at this code here. All right, so if you ever want to try some of this, if you ever want to try this code, right, what you need to do is you need to open up Eclipse, right? I guess you could write it in a notebook too, but I think it's, you have to get used to writing it in Eclipse because you're going to be doing all of your assignments in Eclipse, right? And so if you looked on the course on Q, there is a video posted there that shows you how to make the Hello World program in Eclipse. If you haven't looked at that yet, I'm going to show you basically the same thing. Right, so when you open up Eclipse for the first time, you're going to see basically a blank editor. You might get something else, but basically you've got no Java projects over here. Right, and so what you need to do is you need to make, first of all, you need to make what's called a Java project. Right, so up here under File, you click New, and then you just pick Java project. Press Enter, and then you get this wizard here. Right? So you need to give your project a name. Right? So when you give your project a name, make sure there's no spaces in the name. Right? And so I'm going to call this my first project. My first project. Oh, wait. No, sorry. Source, package. What just happened here? File, new, Java. Oh, sorry. New project. No, I need a project. Sorry, I did the wrong thing. Okay, so you need to give your project a name. So my project. Then you've got a whole bunch of options here, right? Normally you can just ignore these, right? These are for configuring what version of Java you're going to use and other things as well, right? If you're using a newer version of Java, there's going to be this thing down here, right? So there's a thing called module, right? And you'll see there's a little check mark here. It says create module info.java, right? So modules are a feature of Java that we don't talk about in this course. They're useful for when you make a very, very large Java project consisting of many, many classes. Right? They're there to help you organize your class and other things as well. Right? So if you want to, you can uncheck that box. Right? And that actually saves you some pain. So I recommend that for this course you uncheck the box. Right? I'm going to leave it checked for now. But for you, I would recommend unchecking it. Right? I'm going to leave it checked. Next. You'll come to some settings. Again, you can generally just skip all this and click Finish. Right? If you have not unchecked the module box, it's going to ask you for a module name. Again, just hit Create. Right? And then you'll see there's a module info.java. Right? So that gets created for you. If you end up in this situation, close it right away because you don't want to touch this file. Right? So that goes away. All right. So now I need to make a class. So there's my project. Inside the project, I can put some classes. Okay. So if you didn't uncheck that box, it's automatically going to create what's called a package for you here. Right? And I'm pretty sure if you didn't uncheck that box, it won't let you use an empty one. Right? So you have to put something in here. Package names should be the same as, package names should always be in all lowercase. There shouldn't be a space. So I'm just going to call this Well, let's just call it my project as well. Now you give your class a name. So I'll make it look the same as the lecture, so I'm going to call this lecture 2, even though it's lecture 3. If you want a main method to be in your class, just click that box there, and Eclipse will stick it in for you. I'm going to uncheck it because I don't want one here. Press finish. Right? And now you've got your lecture2.java file. Right? So now we can go ahead and add our code here. Right? So I've got a method public static int max2 int a int b.
Do I need a package?
You need a package if you did not uncheck that module.info box. If you uncheck it, then you don't need a package. Right? That's why I recommend unchecking it, because that lets you create classes without having to make a package. I'll explain what packages are in a later lecture. It's a way of organizing your, it's just a way of organizing your code. Yes? Sorry? Oh, no, so I was saying you can, so the video does this for Hello World. I'm just going to replicate what I've got on the slides today, yeah. Okay, so int twice? Sure. Equals a plus b plus math abs a minus b. Okay, so also notice that there is there's no function called abs in Java, right? There is a method called math.abs in Java, and that's the method that you use to compute the absolute value of a number. Right, and then return twice divided by 2. I think it's twice max, but whatever, it's fine. Right. Go ahead and save that. Right. Now there's no main method here. So if you try to run this, nothing will happen. Right. So in order to run this code, I need a class that's got a main method in it. So back here under my project, under this package, you're going to create a new class. So file, new class. Okay, so I'm going to call this test lecture 2. And I'm going to put a main method in. So I'm going to check that box. If you don't check the box, you have to put it in manually. If you check the box, Eclipse sticks in the main method for you. Right? Now we just go ahead and edit this. So int x equals 5, int y equals -3, int max equals lecture 2, max 2, x and y. Right? Notice that Eclipse tries to guess at what you want to use for the arguments. Right? So there it filled in x and y for me, so I can just press enter a couple of times and away we go. Right? I guess I can print this out. So system.out.println, we'll just print out the value of max. Right? Okay, so once you've done that, don't forget to save. So there's a little save button up here, or you can do File, Save, or you can do Command S in Mac or Control S in Windows. Right? And now you can run it. So there's a little green button up here that looks like a play button. You can also go to Run, and then Run. So Run will compile your program, and then if the program compiles successfully, it'll run. So in this case, I should get, oh, there. Right? Down here, you should see a window open up, and it should print out whatever you asked it to print here. So it prints out 5. So indeed, I can, in fact, compute the max of 5 and -3, which is not that exciting. Right? Okay, so one more thing to show you. I'm going to make a different package. So new, package, other, some silly name. Okay, so now I've got a project that consists of 2 packages, right? I've got package my project, and I've got package other. Right? I'm going to take test lecture 2, and I'm going to drag it into other. Right? And so now now the package lecture test, sorry, the class test lecture 2 is now in a different package. Right? Now Eclipse was smart enough to change something for me, so I'm going to nuke that. Okay, so if you have a class that's inside of a different package, that contains the method that you want to call. Right? So lecture 2 is in package my project. Test lecture 2 is in the package other. Right? Then when you try to call the method here, I don't know if you can see this, but in Eclipse, Eclipse has got that underlined in red. Right? So if you ever see red inside your editor window, Eclipse is trying to tell you there's a problem. Right? There's also a little red X here. Right? And if you look at, I don't know if you can read that, it says lecture 2 can't be resolved. So the compiler is complaining, it doesn't know what this class lecture 2 is. Right? And the reason it doesn't know what the class is because it only looks inside of the current package for all other classes. Right? It also looks in a package called java.lang, but never mind about that for now. Right? So it doesn't know where this class lecture 2 is, or that this class even exists. You have to tell it that the class exists. And the way you do that is with an import statement. Right? So the way you use an import statement is you give the package name, so that's my project. Right? And then you say the name of the class that you want to import, so that's lecture 2. Right? And now Eclipse is happy. Right? So the import statement is needed if you want to use a class that's not inside the same package as the one you're currently in. Right? If everything's in the same package, then you don't need the import statement. All right, and this runs like that. Right? So the import statement is similar to the Python import statement. It doesn't work the same way, right? So you can write from module import whatever. You can't do that in Java. Right? You can import a class. There is something else you can import, but never mind for now. Right? So you can import a class, but that's the extent of it in Java. All right. So there, if you haven't done it yet, that's how you make a project and a class in Eclipse. Right? Once you've got your project set up, making the classes is straightforward. Where are we here? Okay, here we go. Do we want to? Okay, so I'm not going to. I guess in the next lecture I'll show you how to use the debugger with that method. Oh, wait, let's do it now. Lecture 2. Okay. So there's something wrong with this method, right? It seems to work when we pass in 5 and minus 3, right? Can anybody guess when it's not going to work? Sorry? 0. Sure, let's try it. 0 and what? 0 and 0. It's actually not a bad guess. 0 often causes problems, right? But not in this case. Right? That's fine. Okay, so go back and look at that, stare at it for a second. Given what the topic of the last lecture was, can anybody see what the problem with this method is? Yeah. Yeah. If A plus B overflows, the answer is wrong, right? It has the wrong sign, right? So that could overflow. It doesn't have just the wrong sign, it has the wrong value, right? If A minus B overflows, it has the wrong value, right? If that doesn't overflow, and that doesn't overflow, it's still possible for that to overflow, right? So there's 3 cases, there's 3 possible sources of overflow in this method, right? So not only is this a silly way to implement the method, right? It's actually broken. It's going to overflow in many possible cases, right? And you can try that out, right? So we know that the maximum value is roughly 2 billion. So 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Right, that's 2 billion. I can pick another large number. So I'll pick 1 billion. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Right? The maximum value of those 2 is clearly 2 billion, but if you run that method, you now get a negative value. Right? So the maximum value of 2 positive values is negative. Right? Math in a language like Java doesn't behave the same as math in the real world. Right? You run into these issues where with integer math, you run into things like overflow. With floating point, you're going to see in a few lectures, you run into other issues as well. That's a good answer in this case, right? So how do you fix this? You have to make sure that the overflow doesn't happen, right? So the suggestion was use long, right? Now I haven't actually told you what long is. So long is basically the bigger version of int, right? So it can hold a much wider range of values than int can. So let's try that. So I'm going to compute twice, hopefully using long arithmetic, right? So I'm going to change return type of twice to long. Okay? Now, if you look at this, right, again, Eclipse has this underlined in red. There's a little X over here. If you hover over the error, it tells you type mismatch, cannot convert from long to int, right? And that's because you told it max2 returns an int, which makes sense, right? The max of 2 int values should be an int. Here, you've got an expression that involves a long value and an int value. So you've got two types that are different. Right? And so the basic rule to remember for now, right, is that if you have two different types and an arithmetic expression, then the bigger type is the result. Then the bigger type determines how the result is calculated. Right? So twice is a long, right? It's a bigger value than int, right? So when Java sees long divided by int, Java converts the int to a long and does everything with long arithmetic. You now have a long divided by a long, so Java says that the value is a long, right? And so I can't return a long value because the return type is int. So what you have to do is you have to tell the compiler, hey, the result of this is actually an int. So the way you do that is with what's called a cast in Java. So a cast in Java takes one numeric type and converts it to a different numeric type. At least, I mean, that's sufficient for the time being, right? So I want to compute this value, right? It has to be in parentheses here because of the precedence of the cast operator, right? So I want to compute this value first. That's a long value. I then have to convert it to an int value, right? Okay, let's see if this works. So there's my code. I've saved it, right? Go back to my test class and run it. And it's still wrong. It's the exact same result. So that didn't fix things. All right, so why didn't it fix anything? Right? You can't change this to long, right? Well, it doesn't make sense to change this to long because you're taking the max of 2 ints, so it makes sense that you want to return an int, right? Also, the user who's calling this probably wants back an int. They don't want back a long, right? Everything looks fine, right? So you said, hey, look, twice is a long. But what you have to remember is how does Java determine how is an operation computed, right? So when you have an arithmetic operation like a plus b, Java says what is the type of a and what is the type of b, right? Well, a is an int, b is an int, so when it computes a plus b, it computes it as an int, right? In other words, your overflow problem is still here, right? The return type doesn't matter. The variable type here doesn't matter, right? It's the type of the operands that determines which operation is used, right? A is an int, B is an int, so the addition here is int arithmetic, right? A and B are ints, so the difference is done using int arithmetic, so that still overflows in some cases, right? That's an int, that's also an int, right? So that's going to be int arithmetic again. So everything here still overflows, right? Even though you said you want the result to be stored in a long variable, right? So the type of the variable doesn't determine how the result is computed, right? Here, everything is computed using ints, and then it gets converted to a long and stored in twice. What you have to do here is you have to tell Java that, hey, everything really should be a long, right? So the easiest way in this case is to do long x equals a, long y equals b, and now change all the a's and b's to x and y's. X, y. x, y. Right? Now, x and y is long, so it gets computed using long arithmetic. X minus y are both longs, so it gets computed using long arithmetic. That's a long. That's a long. So that sum also gets computed using long arithmetic. Right? And now, we get the right answer. So you might ask the question, well, can't these overflow? Right? And it turns out the answer is no. In this case, they can't overflow because the original values of a and b were both int. Right? So if you take two ints and add them, it easily fits inside the range of long. Right? So this won't overflow. Right? This is a lot trickier to fix than you would think. Right? There's a lot of rules you need to remember, right? And you need to know exactly how does Java compute all of these values. What else do I want to say about this? I guess that's it for now. That's it for this particular example. Okay, anybody have any questions about that example? Yes?
So if you were to essentially call the function Python, it's just that
Sorry, if you were to call...
If you're calling it, is that you get your output there? So if you call it system.out, I assume it's called there.
Oh, I see. So if you don't... No. If I take out the print, that's where it gets called. So it gets stored in max, right? And then that's it. Nothing happens.
So you have to do that in order to actually call it.
Yeah, if you want to call the method, you have to call the method, right? Yeah. Yeah. So if you run this, nothing gets printed, right? Because you didn't tell it to print the value.
And that's just for every
method. No. If you want to print the result of the screen, you have to print it. Yeah. Hold on, not done. Not quite done yet. Just a second here. Oh, now I've lost my train of thought. Okay, so I guess I'm done. So we'll pick up the lecture from this slide in the next class.